If you don't rig your flies correctly, you will never catch fish. Okay, that's a bit dramatic and not entirely true, but trust me, how you rig your flies matters. After all, we know the most important skill an angler can master is presenting your flies in as lifelike a way as possible so that the fish think your fake bug is the real thing. If your flies aren't rigged up correctly, it makes it that much harder to get a great presentation. On today's show, I'll walk you through how I rig my dries, my nymphs, and my streamers, and why I like to rig my flies that way. These are the same rigs that I've used for over 20 years of my own fly fishing, during my time as a guide, and in teaching thousands of anglers how to fly fish here at VFC. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Today, we are talking all about the different rigs to use when fishing with dries, nymphs, and streamers, and why those rigs matter so much. If you followed us here at VFC for any length of time, then you know one of the things that we really try to teach beginners is not just the concepts themselves, not just, oh, here's how to cast, here's how to pick a fly, but here's why you're doing it this way. Here's why you're picking this fly. Because when you understand the why behind a concept, you really understand that and you internalize it. It makes you more effective at the end of the day. So we are going to spend a lot of the time today diving into the why behind the way we rig our flies. But before we get into the details and actually talk about it, I'm going to tell you all a story that's going to drive home just how important this concept of correctly rigging your flies is. So get comfortable, grab a Diet Coke, kick your feet up, and get ready, because it's story time. It was 7 or 8 years ago. I was out fishing with a buddy of mine, one of my best friends. His name's Ryan McCullough. Everything I know about fishing small dry flies, or fishing dry flies in general, I learned from Ryan. This guy's, he's a wizard. That's the best way to put it, best way to describe it. What he can do with dry flies on a fly rod, just outstanding. The man, he's the one who coined the phrase, you want to land your dry fly as soft as a butterfly with sore feet. That's always been his phrase. And I've stolen it and used it in articles, and I'm sure I've used it in podcasts before. But that was Ryan's phrase. He really does that, though. He really can land his dry flies like a butterfly with sore feet. It's amazing what this guy can do. If I can be half the dry fly angler someday that Ryan is, then I will have done something pretty great with my dry fly fishing. Well, we were fishing this blue-winged olive hatch together, and the water was extremely low and clear. Like the fish could see you blink from 50 feet away, low and clear. Tough conditions, but the fish were rising. They were eating tons of bugs. The hatch was going. It was a good situation to be in. It wasn't one of those sparse hatches. There were a lot of bugs out on the water. Well, Ryan and I get to this one spot where a fish that looked like it was probably 20 inches or so. It was rising steadily in this small channel between two piles of moss. And the channel was maybe a foot across, and the fish was rising smack against the right side of it. So if I wanted to catch that fish, I would have to get my fly after a pinpoint perfect cast. I would have to drop the fly in a small target area, but also I would have to keep my fly line far enough away from the fish to not spook it, because again, the water was so low and clear that you had to be far away from these fish. You had to land your flies and fly line and leader as soft as possible. We'd already spooked a fair amount of fish, and when I say we, I mean me. I already spooked a fair amount of fish because I hadn't been soft enough in my presentations. We were fishing long leaders. I think I had a 12-foot leader on at that point. But Ryan, before I even started casting to that, he looked at me and said, wait. And he rigged up a 17-foot 7X leader with a size 24 parachute midge. It was the cherry on top to his concoction. He hands me his rod and he says, don't mess up. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that. I actually really do. It was a great way to teach me, and no pressure at all, though, right? I stepped up to make the cast, and I was shaking. I was like, man, what's going on? I feel like I'm back in 6th grade having to give a book report on something I didn't read, and the teacher's going to know. Oh. Well, by some miracle, I'm not sure to this day how it happened, I made a perfect cast. And that fly dropped into the slot. The fish ate it. I set the hook and I ended up putting a 21-inch brown. That fish was 21 inches long into the net. Now, that's an extreme example of the way that I rigged my fly, making a big difference. But I share this story to illustrate the point that your rigs and your presentation go hand in hand to create the best drift possible. Now, earlier on, and to start the show off, I joked that you're never going to catch fish if you don't rig your flies correctly. That's not entirely true. I admit that. I said that to get your attention and admit it. It worked, didn't it? But as you could see from the story that I just shared, the rig matters. The way I put that rig, the way that Ryan put the rig together for me, that mattered a whole lot. If I just tied on a regular old 9-foot 6X leader and thrown maybe a size 18 parachute midge instead, I'd thrown that out to the fish, would I have caught it? Would I have caught that specific fish with a less than ideal rig? Probably not, because my fly line would have landed too close, would have scared the fish since the water was so low and clear. We had to be careful. Oh, and if you're not familiar with what I mean by the water being low and clear and spooking the fish, fly line lands harder than your leader and your tippet. It makes a bigger splash on the water because it's heavier, it weighs more. So when the water gets really low and clear, you've got to be as far away from the fish as possible so that when your fly line lands, it's nowhere near the fish so it won't spook it. Ideally, you want that fly line as far away as possible from the fish, so that's why you end up using longer leaders at some point, and that's why we use a 17-foot leader in that point. It was, I still can't believe the 17-foot leader. It's ridiculous. Tangles for days if you screw up with that. That's all I'm saying. But you get lucky sometimes. Maybe in some world I would have caught that fish without the rig that I used, but I highly doubt it. I don't think I would have gotten lucky at all. I think I just would have spooked it and it would have ran away and scampered off, and I would have been frustrated that I missed yet another fish. Now, remember, your rig can impact how your flies behave on the water. That 17-foot 7X leader presented the fly with absolutely no drag, and it kept the fly far enough away from my fly line so I didn't line the fish. If I'd used 6X instead, there's a good chance I would have had micro drag, and that would have put the fish down. The rig you use matters. I can't drive that point home enough. On a smaller scale, it'll play out in everyday trout fishing too. It's not going to be as obvious or as grandiose as, I've got to use a 17-foot leader here because Durant said so on Untangled the other day. It's not always going to be to that scale, but that concept is going to still work into your everyday, more normal trout fishing situations. So, speaking of that, let's dig into the rigs themselves. We'll start with dry fly rigs, and then I'm going to run you through the rigs that I use for each type of fly, and I'll give you some use cases for each different idea as well, so you understand when I like to fish those certain rigs. For those who watch the show, we'll have diagrams up on the screen. We're also putting together a pocket rigs guide that I will link in the show notes for you. For anyone who wants to download these diagrams to their phone, it's a lot like our pocket nymphing guide, which we've had for a while. So same idea, but with rigs instead. So we are going to start, like I said, with dry flies. And the first dry fly rig is just a single dry fly rig. It's simple. There's not much to this rig at all. You're going to start out putting this rig together by grabbing a leader that's sized appropriately for your fly. If you're going to fish a size 16 caddis, for example, a 5X leader is going to be ideal because you take the size of your fly and you divide it by 3 and then round up. So a 16 divided by 3 rounded up is about 5X. So that's a good rule of thumb. Now, your leader size matters because if your leader is too thick and too heavy, it's going to land with more force on the water. It's going to be more aggressive. You're not going to get as soft and as subtle a presentation as you need for a bug like a size 16 caddis. And then on the other hand, if you're trying to throw a size 8 hopper with 7X tippet, it's just not going to work. That tippet's too thin. It doesn't have the mass to help turn that big bug over during the cast. So the leader size definitely matters. And the size of leader is also going to affect the drag on the fly. I mentioned that earlier. And for those who don't know what drag is, that's just when the line is pulling on the fly in a way that the fly is not moving naturally on top of the water. And if your leader or your tippet is too thick, it's going to drag your dry fly. So make sure you're sizing your leader to the dry fly appropriately. For my single dry flies, I always like to use at least a 9-foot leader personally. That's what I do, even if I'm fishing a smaller rod. But the best rule of thumb is to use a leader that's the same length as your fly rod. And since most of us fish 9-foot 5 weights, a 9-foot 5X leader is the play here. You'll attach that leader to your fly line using either the loop-to-loop connection or a nail knot. I prefer the nail knot. I think it goes through the guides better, but there's nothing wrong with the loop-to-loop connection either. And then you're going to tie your fly to the end of the leader. Finally, you're going to add some floatant to keep it dry, and boom, you are fishing. Now, the floatant side of things, we've had a few comments and questions about floatant in our group recently. We have a group, for those who don't know, it's on a platform called School. There's a link to join it in the show notes. It's basically like Facebook, but it doesn't suck. There's no politics or crazy Aunt Jody's telling you about their 9th husband they married or whatever. It's just a place where you can share fishing stories, get advice, and talk to other anglers. So if you're interested, you can join it. Again, there will be a link in the show notes. But we've had a few questions in there recently about how to use floatant, what floatant we use. When I'm fishing dry flies, I use the liquid floatant first, and I always use the Loon Aquel. That's what we've used here at VFC. That's what's in our starter packs. And I was using that, years before I even met Alex or anybody else here at VFC and got into this. So I put the liquid floatant on first. I add a little bit to the leader as well and grease it up about a foot above the fly. And then once the fly does start to get wet and sink, I use the Loon Top Ride to dry it off. That's my favorite dry floatant, powder floatant. I used to use the Frogs Fanny a lot, but I feel like I go through that stuff a lot. The applicator brush isn't the best. I like how the Loon Top Ride applies to the fly, so that's what I use. The single dry fly rig is best for small streams where it's too shallow or low or clear to run a dropper, or if the fish are feeding on top, or during hopper season when you just want to throw a single fly and keep things nice and simple. The next dry fly rig is the double dry rig. I run this rig a lot during spring and fall mayfly hatches because I'm able to imitate both the emerger and the dun, or a cripple and an emerger, and often fish are going to key in on those particular patterns more than they do the duns themselves. Now, for those who don't know or who aren't familiar with the mayfly life cycle, mayflies, they're a species of aquatic insect. They're prolific. They're in many trout streams across the world. They start out their life as just a little itty bitty nymph living under the water, and then they're eventually going to transform into their adult form, which is also called a dun. But in between the nymph and the adult form, they go into their awkward teenager phase where they're trying to figure out who they are. Their body doesn't work right. It's just things are weird. That's what we call the emerger. And this emerger phase, they shoot up through the water column, and then they actually get stuck in the surface film. They're trying to dry their wings out. They're trying to move. They're trying to, again, they're awkward. They're trying to figure out their bodies and whatnot. And because they're stuck in that surface film, they become a highly, highly valuable food target to trout, because the adult, if you've ever seen an adult mayfly floating on the water, they can just up and fly away whenever. They can escape. The emergers can't. They're stuck in the surface film. That makes them a high value target to trout. And even when there's a ton of duns on the water, the trout will often key in on the emergers instead, because it's more of a sure thing from the trout standpoint. And trout are predators, so they're going to go for the weak link first. Cripples, it's exactly what it sounds like. A cripple is just an adult version of the bug that has some sort of deformity, usually a broken wing or maybe a busted tail, and it can't really get up off the water. The trout are going to go for those as well. Now, I'm going to rig up my double dry fly rig the same way that I do with a single dry fly. But once I've tied on my first dry, I then am going to take around 18 to 24 inches of tippet, and usually I go a size smaller than my leader. but I always want to match this size of tippet to whatever fly I'm tying on next. So I go at least a size smaller than my leader, but sometimes it's more than that depending on the size of the fly that I've got on. For example, I might have a size 16 parachute blue wing and then a size 20 emerger. So I might have 5X going to that size 16, and I might go to 7 for the emerger. So it just depends. You want to make sure, though, that you're at least a size lower. I could go 5X to the 16 and 6X to the 20. I'd be fine at that point as well. And I'm going to tie that chunk of tippet to the bend of the first dry fly hook using a clinch knot. Then I tie my second dry fly to the end of that, and I apply floatant to the first fly and the tippet connecting both the flies. I don't apply floatant to the second fly if it's an emerger, because those are meant to sit right in the surface film or sink a little bit. If it's a cripple, I'll apply floatant to that one as well. I love the double dry fly during mayfly hatches, but it works well during caddis hatches or even midge hatches when the fish are eating on the surface, but you also see a lot of dun and emerger rises at the same time. You're trying to figure out exactly what they're keyed in on. Being able to throw 2 flies at once is great. This is also a great rig if you want to fish an emerger, but it's hard to see those size 20 flies. It's tough. I'm relatively young. I got good eyes, and I still can't see them sometimes. So it's nice to be able to tie on that bigger fly, and that bigger fly almost works as an indicator for the emerger. Even if the fish never eat it, you'll see it move when they eat the emerger. So that's another benefit to throwing this rig. The only hiccup that you might have with this rig is the 2 flies are going to drag each other around if you don't get the cast nailed down quite right. The best remedy for that I've found is to ensure that you're straightening your line out as much as possible in that forward cast. You're really putting some effort into making sure they land nice and straight in the same current so there's no potential for drag. And the next dry fly rig we're going to get into is the dry dropper. This is my favorite way to fish. This is what I fish almost all the time. It lets me cover multiple parts of the water column at once. A dry dropper, really simple. It's just a dry fly with a nymph tied below it. To rig this up, I just tie my dry fly onto my leader just like I would if I was doing a single dry fly. So I'm going to match the dry fly and leader size together. Then I take around at least 2 feet of tippet, sometimes more, but I almost always start out with about 2 feet, and I tie that off the bend of the dry fly hook with a clinch knot. Then I'm going to tie my nymph to that piece of tippet. Again, I've sized the tippet according to the nymph that I'm using, and I usually go one size down for my dry fly for my nymph. So for example, if I've got a size 14 Adams up top, then I'll pick a size 16 Frenchie, let's say, to go as the dropper. The length of that dropper is going to differ based on how deep the water is that I'm fishing and how fast the water is and how heavy my nymph is. I want my nymph to get as close to the bottom as possible, so sometimes that means my dropper is going to be 4 feet. Other times my dropper is just 12 inches. Remember, that nymph needs to be down as close to the bottom as possible, so adjust your dropper depth accordingly. Now, I'll go into details on how to know that your nymph is closer to the bottom in just a minute, so hang on. Now, I know there are multiple ways to rig a dry dropper. You can tie the dropper through the eye of the hook instead of off the bend. You can tie tags. I don't like them. I'm a simple man. I like things nice and easy. You give me wings and Diet Coke and I'm happy forever. But those other rigs, I've tried them, I've fished them. I'm not convinced they work better than this rig. I have never had problems with this rig. I've never had fish refuse my flies because of this rig. I think that when you rig the fly through the eye of the dry fly hook, when you rig the dropper that way, I think it makes your dry fly float funny. I've seen fish not like the way the dry fly was riding because it's being pulled on at the front. I'm just not sold on that being a solid way to do it. And I'm sure there's going to be people who disagree with me, and that's fine. I'm not attacking you personally, and I'm sure you have success with it. That's great. I'm just telling everybody from my experience, what I know from 20 years of fishing, over 20 years of fishing, some time spent as a guide, and then here at VFC, the way that I just explained to rig a dry dropper, it works. It's effective. I don't see an honest need to do something different. And to be honest, this is what I use 80% of the time that I'm out on the water. I'm fishing a dry dropper. They are a fantastic option when you get out there and nothing's actively hatching, or you're fishing a lot of pocket water. This is the rig that I just recommend everyone use when they're fishing. Unless you're in water that's just too deep or fast for this rig to be effective, then you can switch over to Nymphs at that point if you want. But the dry dropper, it's hard for me to oversell just how great this is, how effective it is. And again, it's what I use almost all the time. Now we're going to get into Alex's favorite part of the show, which is the Nymph rigs. We'll start out with the double Nymph rig. You know, if Alex could just fish 2 Nymphs on like 12 foot a leader with a pound of split shot in the middle of winter where they're only eating the size 24 zebra midges, he'd be in heaven. That's his favorite way to fish. He's going to kill me when he hears this part of the show. For those who don't know, we've got a nice little inside joke here with me and Alex. I was raised fishing dry flies. I didn't even know that nymphs were a thing. Honest to goodness, I did not know that nymphs existed till I was about in high school. My dad fished dry flies growing up, and that's all I ever fished. I didn't know nymphs were a thing. When I found that out, my teenage Spencer's mind was just blown. It was, what? There's nymphs and streamers? I couldn't fathom it. It was unfathomable to my mind. So I've always done a lot of dry fly fishing, and that's my passion. If I see a fish rise, I'll tie a dry on and cast to it. And Alex is much more pragmatic. He wants to catch more fish, so he's going to nymph, and he's very good at it. So it's a friendly joke between the two of us that I am the one who will fish dries and Alex loves nymphing. But in reality, we're both pretty good, or we're both pretty fond of each type. I wouldn't say that we're pretty good at it, but we're pretty fond of each type of fishing. Well, the double nymph rig, that's where we'll start out with our nymph rigs. Same deal to start out with as the dry fly. Take a 9-foot leader, sized appropriately to your flies. I rarely use anything smaller than 4X for my nymph leaders. I do like to use fluorocarbon here because it sinks, and it's got a little bit better wet knot strength than nylon does, but you can use nylon and you'll be fine. That's just a personal preference thing. At the end of that leader, I'll use a blood knot or a triple surgeon's knot, and I attach 1 to 2 feet of the same size tippet. So I've got about an 11-foot 4X leader at that point. Then I'm going to pick my nymphs that I'll fish based on the right fly formula. That's a formula we developed here at VFC to help you pick flies, even if you don't know the names of them or anything about entomology or aquatic insects. There's a link in the show notes to a video that explains the right fly formula. But in short, it's just telling you to go to the water, pick up a rock, look underneath the rock, and look at all those bugs crawling around. And you're going to match those bugs to one in your box based on size. That's the most important. Then shape, and then color. So you're going to match based on the right fly formula. And when I pick my bugs, I always tie my biggest or my heaviest on first. I do this because I feel like it casts better for me, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with putting your heaviest fly on the bottom. So you can rig that up however you want. This is just the way that I do it. I put my heaviest fly on first. Then I tie about 18 to 24 inches of tippet off the bend of the hook of that first nymph and tie my second hook onto that piece of tippet. Now remember that knot we tied to attach extra tippet to our leader. Well, that's where you're going to add some split shot so that it doesn't slide down on top of your flies. Because if you need to get these nymphs down deep, you got to add some split shot to help them get down. You don't want that split shot riding right on top of your flies. That can ruin their drift and can ruin your ability to even feel the fish eating it. Excuse me. Now, you want your flies down deep enough because your bottom fly ideally should be just above the bottom of the river, and you'll know it's there if you're snagging bottom every couple of drifts or so. Your indicator also is going to play a role in getting your flies to the right depth. Generally, it's good to start by putting your indicator about 1.5 times the depth of the water. So if the water you're fishing is 4 feet deep, let's say, then I would put the indicator 6 feet above my first nymph. Now, this does not have to be exact. You don't need to go out there and measure the depth of the water. Just take a guess, take a good educated guess, and then you can adjust and fine-tune your rig as you start fishing. That a lot of fishing with nymphs is fine-tuning your rig and taking the information you get from the river and plugging it into what you're doing. So that it's very rare to get the depth exactly dialed on the first time. I don't even remember the last time that I got the depth dialed perfectly on the first rig. I'm always tweaking it. Alex is tweaking his rigs all the time. Again, he's better at nymphing than I am. I'll be straight up about that. And he adjusts his rig way more than I do. He catches more fish than I do when we're both nymphing. Now, if the water is really deep or it's moving quickly, then you're going to increase the distance between your first nymph and the bobber to give you more depth, right? Again, this is all trial and error. You're going to mess around with this until your flies are right above the bottom. Alex recently put together a short on Instagram, TikTok, I believe, both of those platforms. And he came up with his trial and error framework for achieving the right depth, and patent is pending on the framework. He says that if you're snagging on every single cast, you need to move that indicator down. So you're shortening the rig up. If you are never snagging, you need to move the indicator up so that you've got more length between the indicator and the flies. And then if you're catching fish, you're snagging every 4 to 5 casts or towards the end of the drift, you're perfect, you're in the strike zone, your flies are exactly where they need to be. Nymphing is perfect for fishing the deeper runs and pools on a river and for covering water when fish aren't actively rising. And this method will work year-round to catch fish, whereas dry flies don't really catch fish during the winter with a few exceptions. There are tons of different ways to rig nymphs. I'm aware of that as well. I've tried them all. And again, I'm sure we'll get comments about this. I'm sure folks are going to disagree with me. I'm not personally disagreeing with you, right? I'm just saying this is still the method after 20 years of fishing. This is still the method I use to fish my nymphs. This is still what I do. I don't add more complexity to it. I feel like the other rigs, you've got to add more knots to it. There's more potential for tangling during the cast. I like this rig because it's simple. It catches fish for me. I'm used to it. I'm sure that if I'd learned to nymph with a different rig, I'd feel the same way about that. But there's also a reason this is the rig we teach to beginners here at VFC, because it's simple, it's effective, and it works. So learn how to nymph this way first, and then branch out to the other stuff. But figure this out first. This is the foundation for all of the other nymphing rigs. Now, last but surely not least, we've got the streamer rig. I love streamers. I haven't fished streamers in too long. And I like to rig streamers slightly differently than what some folks do, but I think it works well. What I like to do is I take a 5 to 6 foot length of 10-pound fluorocarbon, not leader, just straight fluoro, and I tie that to the end of my fly line with a loop knot. Then I will use a knot called the non-slip mono loop and attach my streamer to the line with that. Using this loop knot gives the streamer more action and more articulation in the water, makes it a little bit more lifelike. I think the fish like it. I almost always use a sink tip line when I'm fishing with streamers as well, and heavy flies, because I want my streamers down deep. If you don't have a sink tip line, a heavy fly with some split shot on the leader, a foot or two above the fly, will work just fine. That's all there is to the streamer rig. It really is simple. You're just throwing it out there, and you're trying to make it look like some sort of bait fish, or even a smaller trout if you're using a really big streamer. That's what you're trying to make the streamers imitate. So a lot of fishing streamers comes in how you retrieve them and how you move the line and even your rod to give that streamer action and articulation and life in the water. So we'll go into more details on fishing streamers, I'm sure, in a later episode, but that's how you rig them up. I really like this rig for streamers because it casts a lot better than a tapered leader. This is the only time I've personally found for trout fishing that you don't want a nice tapered leader. It just casts so much better when it's short and it's thicker. Streamers are also ideal if the water is a bit high, or if it's off color, or if the fish are aggressive because it's getting to be fall or spring. and they're aggressive in the fall because you've got some fish that are spawning, but then they're also trying to pack the pounds on for winter. They got to make it through that winter. And then they're aggressive again in the spring because they made it through the winter and dadgummit, they're hungry. They're like me. After I've decided, no, I'm going to try and lose some weight and get about 5 hours into it and you're ravenous. You can't stop. So that's why they get aggressive. I don't fish streamers very much during the summer. I really focus my streamer time to the fall and the spring. So that wraps up everything about rigs. I hope that was a helpful overview of everything. If you have any questions about rigs or you want to know more about it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. There's links to get a hold of us in the show notes. We're on social media. The Pony Express can find us. Carrier Pigeons can find us. And we'll even do smoke signals. We'll even do smoke signals. But don't go anywhere, folks. The show ain't over yet because we've got the Q&A section coming right up.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we dedicate half the show to directly answering questions from our listeners and our viewers. These questions fuel the show. We can't do Untangled without them. So if you've got a question you would like answered, go ahead and submit them. There's always a link to do that in the show notes. This first question comes to us. Brent from South Carolina writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. My name is Brent, and I am brand new to fly fishing. As in, just got an Orvis Clearwater outfit and haven't got it on the water yet. First of all, I have learned a ton through the podcast, and the Masterclass series is simply amazing. Best YouTube series I have found. Oh, and I'm a Coke Zero guy. Drinking Pepsi is like cooking on a gas grill when charcoal is available. Is it really an option? Anyway, my question is this. Where do you start with flies when you go fishing? Dries, nymphs, streamers? Do you always start with a certain one and then work your way around? Again, I'm brand new, so I don't have a clue. Thanks for all you guys do. Your information is educational and fun. Coke all the way. P.S. I love me some chicken wings too. Tight lines and stay safe." And Brent, you hit every part of this question. I mean, wing jokes, Coke and Pepsi references. I mean, the only knock against you is that you got the Orvis Clearwater instead of the Fly Flinger. So come on, man, fix it. Thanks for sending your question, though, Brent. I appreciate it. My rule of thumb is this. If the bugs are active, and they should hatch at some point during the day, then I'm going to tie a dry dropper on and I'm going to get to work. Unless I'm fishing something really deep, then I'll nymph it. But even then, sometimes I'll still try to make the dry dropper work. Again, I really love fishing with dry flies. So that means from mid-spring all the way through late fall, I'm fishing a dry dropper. When I fish in the winter, I'm almost always running a double nymph rig, maybe a streamer rig if things get crazy, but I usually don't fish streamers during the winter anyways. But I don't worry about the dry dropper during the winter because the bugs aren't really hatching. So I just go straight to a double nymph rig at that point. The only time I stray away from fishing a dry dropper is if I get to the river and I see a hatch happening. Then I'll fish a dry or a double dry rig, depending on what kind of hatch it is. I'll fish streamers in the spring and the fall, but when I fish streamers, it's a dedicated streamer day. I'm usually fishing them from a drift boat. My favorite way to fish streamers is from a boat. That's so much fun. Oh, I love it. I'm going to do that this fall. Maybe I'll make a video about it for you guys. I love it so much. I'll share it with you. I really don't fish streamers much during the summer at all. The big picture here, though, is that you should let the river and the fish tell you what to tie on. But starting out with a dry dropper every time is a good idea. That covers two parts of the water column. And again, if you're early spring to late fall, there's going to be dry fly activity at some point during the day. Fish are going to be looking up. It's not going to be out of the ordinary to catch something on a dry fly. And then if you can imitate, let's say it's caddis season. You've got a caddis on top and a Frenchie underneath. You've covered half the caddis life cycle between the nymph and the dry version of it. You're just missing the emerger. Well, boom, at that point, you covered 2/3 of the caddis life cycle. That's fantastic. You're giving the fish more options, more opportunity to eat, even if the dries aren't active at that point. That's one of the many reasons the dry dropper is just so effective, and it's doubling your chances of hooking a fish. So who doesn't like that? Hopefully that helps, Brent. I appreciate you sending your question on in, and if you need any clarification, please don't hesitate to reach back out. Tommy from North Carolina writes in next and says, when you are deciding on leader and tippet for your fly, I know to use the rule of divide by 3 or 4. However, when doing a whole multiple fly setup, how do you decide the leader and tippet setup? Do you use the largest fly or a point or an average of the two and then divide by 3 or 4? New drink time, Dr. Pepper, zero sugar, strawberries, and cream. I haven't tried the coconut version yet. Keep rocking, guys. Hey, Tommy, that was a great question. Thank you. It's timely, too. It fits in with the topic. I mentioned a bit in the main part of the show, but I'll address it again here. Definitely need to. Your leader should always be sized to that first fly. After that, you're going to size your tippet to the fly that's attaching to. If I've got a size 14 dry fly, for example, I'm going to use 4X tippet to that. And then if I've got a size 18 zebra midge on underneath that, I can go to 5 or even 6X if I want to. The leader should always be sized to your first fly, and then the tippet is sized to the next fly that's coming on. Hopefully that makes sense, but that's the way you should rig it up. And then as far as the Dr. Pepper comments, I've tried the strawberries and cream, the zero sugar one. It's pretty good. Not bad. My mother-in-law has a love affair with Dr. Pepper, as most mother-in-laws do. I've noticed that's a mother-in-law thing. I wonder what the deal is there. She loves the coconut one, though. She's over the moon for that, but I haven't tried it. I'm not the biggest fan of coconut. The one Dr. Pepper I really enjoyed was the dark berry. I think they need to bring that back. That was a solid option. So thanks, Tommy, for the question and for the opportunity to have a little soda chat. Appreciate it a bunch. Thank you. Blair from Idaho has our next question. Was in Yellowstone Park fishing a week or so ago. The wind was brutal, heard up to 50 plus miles an hour. Since it was the only day to fish, we kept fishing, but as you can imagine, it was virtually impossible. How do you fish without whipping yourself in the face or hooking a tree and actually catch fish? Side note, West Yellowstone does not have the best wings. Oh, Blair, thanks for sending this in, man. Good to hear from you. Yeah, Blair's a good buddy of mine. I've known him for, how long has it been? Been a while, 7 or 8 years probably. Really good feller. And he and I live he doesn't live too far from Yellowstone, and I don't live too far from Yellowstone. So earlier this summer, I think it was end of June, maybe 1st of July, we shot out to meet up on the fire hole one day. And first off, I was late because there were 2 buffalo jams. I show up late. By the time I got there, because of the buffalo jam and whatnot, the fire hole is already too warm to fish. And so we decided to go somewhere else because we're not going to fish the fire hole when it's that warm. So we start cruising. We decide to go down and fish the Madison inside the park. I'd actually never fished the Madison in the park before. So we're like, yeah, we'll do it. We'll give it a shot. Why not? And as soon as we get into the Madison right there, the wind just starts going, and it did not stop. It was out of control. Like Blair said, it was 50 mile an hour gusts. It was out of control. So we take this break halfway through the day, hoping that maybe the wind would die down. We go into West Yellowstone to grab some food, and I wanted wings, of course. So we went to this place that said it had great wings. They were awful. I'm still not. They were bad. It's hard to screw up wings, but they managed. They weren't crispy. The sauce was meh. It was an affront to everything I hold dear. We'll just leave it at that. Anyways, best thing I found, Blair, to help with fishing in the wind is I quit casting directly above my head and I move the cast to the side instead. So it's a sidearm casting motion. That definitely helps. If the wind is blowing directly in my face, I've found that it's a lot easier to just let the wind blow my back cast. Don't fight it there. And then throw a big haul on the front cast and really push that fly rod through the casting stroke instead of just moving my arm gently and letting the rod do the work, I'll really put some extra force behind it and try and increase the line speed that I've got going on. Timing becomes really important when you're fishing in the wind so that you don't lose your momentum. The cast has to be timed really well to excel in the wind. That's why a lot of beginners struggle with it. If the wind's blowing at my back, I just cast like normal and let the wind push the cast forward for me. I don't really change anything if the wind's at my back. The biggest help to casting in the wind is going to be generating a high line speed. I mentioned that just a second ago. And all that means is that your line is moving a lot quicker through the air. If the line speed's high, the line's moving quicker, it's got more energy, it's got more speed, the wind's going to have less of an impact on the line that's moving quickly versus the line that's moving slowly. The best way to accomplish this is using a double haul during the cast. The double haul, it's just a casting technique where at different points during the cast, you pull down hard on the fly line. You do it right as you move the cast back and right as you move the cast forward. And that yank down on the line, that haul actually increases the line speed a ton and gets you a little bit tighter of a loop. You've got the line moving quicker, and that's a great way to cast through the wind. I actually did an entire episode on casting in the wind, and there was a video linked in that episode to Ray Jeff casting in the wind out in the salt water. So there's a lot of resources there. I'll link that podcast in the show notes for anybody else and for you, Blair. Thanks again for sending that question in, man. Good to hear from you. Donald from New York has our next question, writes in and says, I inherited a box full of nymphs and flies. What's the best way to determine what type and sizes I have? Donald, we get this question so much. So much. It's amazing, actually, how many people ask us this question. I put off answering it on the show because there's no easy answer. I wish there was. The biggest problem, the biggest issue is that there is no standardization for hook sizes in the fly fishing industry. It doesn't exist. There used to only be a couple of hook manufacturers, so there was a standard back then because they didn't differ too much from each other, but that's changed in recent years. I mean, these days I can go get a size 14 from one company and it's completely different than a size 14 from another. The shank lengths are different, the hook gap's different, the wire size is different. It's anarchy. I think the fly fishing industry would benefit a little bit from standard flies and non-standard fly sizes, but that's a whole other discussion, and I won't get on that soapbox today. The closest thing to a standard anymore, in my opinion, this is just my 2 cents. Tires out there might and probably will disagree with me, but the hooks that I see is, that looks standard. That looks like what a 14 should look like, are some of the series of hooks from Umpqua. In particular, their Tiemco 100 and 101 hooks are a great standard for dries or any fly tied on a straight shank. And then their 2488, that's the great standard for nymph hooks. That's my favorite for the nymphs. So one option that you have is to buy some hooks of different sizes from those hook families that I mentioned, and then use those hooks as a standard to judge the size of flies that you have. That can be pretty spendy, though, and probably tough and very time-consuming. Here's the thing, though. Knowing what size flies you have doesn't really matter. Because if you're out on the water and you're following the right fly formula, which we discussed earlier in the show, then you're matching based on size anyways. You don't need to be able to turn a rock over and see a mayfly nymph and, oh yeah, it's a size 18. I'll grab an 18 out of my box. I can do that because I've been doing this for so long. I've got the fly sizes memorized, and I can judge what they are just based on looking at them. And you'll get there eventually. As you do this more, you'll get to that point. But it's not necessary, because you should just turn that over and say, oh yeah, it's a small one, and pick something out of your box that matches that size. The fact that it's an 18 doesn't matter at all. What matters is you're matching to the size. So my 2 cents on that. It doesn't really matter at all. But knowing what patterns you have, that can definitely help. And one idea I've got, I have no idea if this works. So try this out, Donald. Let me know. I'd be curious. Take a picture of each individual fly and then reverse image search that online. Google's got some tools for it, and AI is doing all sorts of crazy stuff now. I'm fairly certain it can tell you what flies you've got just based on the pictures. So try it out. Let me know. I hope that works. A final option also would be to take the flies into a fly shop and compare them with what's in the fly shop bins. You might also find some success there. I appreciate that question, Donald. Thank you so much. And folks, we're not done yet. We've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Our goal here at VFC is to help everyone live a real life by getting out on the water and having a great time. And we want to hear the stories of you living your real life. So each week we share a story from listeners and viewers about their time living real life. There's a link to submit your Live Real Life moment in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Britton. He sent in a picture, which will show on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on audio, I put the picture in the show notes as well, so you're not left out, including everybody. Well, that's what we're about here, VFC. Britton writes in and says, "Hello, Ventures Flyco and community. Over the last few months, I have finally gotten into fly fishing and have used your content, the Untangled podcast, beginner fly fishing masterclass series, etc., to get me jump-started with the fundamentals behind this great hobby. I am still learning, but have already had the opportunity as a traveling geologist to experience some of the great waters of the Southwest. In my photo, I am holding a rainbow trout recently caught from the gorgeous Fish Lake nestled within Utah. This work trip actually produced the first fish I have ever caught on a dry fly. The experience of being knee-deep in the cold, calm waters during the surface feeding time for trout is something I'll never forget. I'd like to thank Spencer, Alex, and everyone behind the scenes for giving me a passion I will carry for the rest of my life. I hope I can inspire and teach others to appreciate the outdoors and the wildlife within." Britton, thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. We'll make sure we pass the thanks on to everybody here at VFC as well. And congrats on the fish. First on a dry fly. That's always great. I love it. I love to see it. You're hooked. And that traveling geologist job sounds really interesting as well. Congrats, man. Thanks again for sending it in. Appreciate you a bunch. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up this week's show. Thank you so much for listening, being with us, being here every week. I can't do the show without you. Can't do the show without the listeners. I really do appreciate it. If you haven't already, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you listen. The more ratings and subscriptions we get means the show reaches a wider audience and we can help more anglers get out there and live real life, which is what we are all about here at VFC. If you've got questions you would like answered, please submit those as well. There's always a link in the show notes, and we want your Live Real Life moments. There's a link for those in the show notes as well. Until next week, everybody, we're getting close to fall, so get out there, take advantage of the rest of the great fishing, live real life, and tight lines.